अस्सलाम वालेकुम व्यूअर्स, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल। उम्मीद करती हूँ आप सब खैरियत से होंगे। आज का हमारा टॉपिक है इंट्रोडक्शन ऑफ क्रिश्चियनिटी। इट वुड सीम दैट फॉर सम टाइम आफ्टर द इंट्रोडक्शन ऑफ क्रिश्चियनिटी विच बिगेन एट द एंड ऑफ द 6th century, native and foreign literature run largely in separate channels. There can be little doubt that heroic poetry was the most highly cultivated form of native literature. Welsh poetry earlier than the 12th century is by no means well preserved as English, with one expectations. The poems are known only from medieval, of which the most important date from c. 1150 to 1350. Three of these medievals contain religious poetry of Latin and history, but the majority of the poems belong to the native tradition. In these latter also passage of Christian character occur frequently, but reference to heathen beliefs and ideas are more in evidence than in the English poem. A curious fact, since Britain had been nominally a Christian country since the Roman period. On the other hand, in contrast with English poetry, which with rare expectations purely native in form, Welsh poetry regularly shown rhyme, which presumably of Latin origin. The use of stanzas of 3, 4 or more lines is also extremely frequent. Native features are, however, preserved in the frequent prevalence of alliteration and in the occurrence of much irregularity in the length of the line. In other respects, Latin influence seems to be slight. The poetry is of very verified character, but narrative is particularly wanting. Very little prose survived from before the 12th century, and this is of Latin derivation. But from the 12th and following centuries, there are small number of stories, especially the four Mabinogi, while belong to the native prose tradition in form as well as in substance. Few other and under French influence, a large amount of native tradition is summarized in the form of triads, some of which will quoted later. The last thought late appear to be native origin from and substance. The large proportion of the poem and prayers relate to person of the 6th century, the majority of whom belong to Scotland and the north of England. We use the term British when speaking of the period. Difficulties of every kind, textual, linguistic and historical, abound both in these and many other poems. Some of them appear be veritable palimpsests. In other, the train of thought is extremely obscure. Ireland and Iceland are the chief home of sage literature. Both countries have preserved a large amount of literature from native tradition. In Ireland, Latin literature began in the 15th century with the writing of St. Patrick. Irish, apart from the inspiration, seem to have been first written in the 7th century, both in law and in religious literature of Latin derivations. The writing of literature from native tradition can be tracked back to the early part of the 18th century, though none of the existing medieval of it are earlier than the 12th century. Many forms of native literature are represented, but saga is perhaps the most extensive and important. Much of it relates to very early times. Latin influence is often visible, but usually it is more or less superficial. Heathen beliefs are of common occurrence, and even gods are frequently introduced, though these are not described as gods. सो ये था हमारा आज का टॉपिक। उम्मीद करती हूँ कि आपको आज की वीडियो पसंद आई होगी। पसंद आए तो वीडियो को लाइक कीजिएगा, शेयर कीजिएगा, चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करना मत भूलिएगा। थैंक यू।